So I want to provide a little video review of an important book about the social structural differentiation in Chinese history that has been completely overlooked. It was published in 2004, written by a Taiwanese sociologist named Tang Chih-Chieh, and he is now working for Academia Sinica in Taipei. But before he was a PhD student in Germany, and the book I'm gonna present here is his German dissertation, and it's a very important work. It's probably the first systematic account of the history of social differentiation in Imperial China and in modern Taiwan. But of course, it has largely been overlooked in the last 10 years because it was published in German, and it's 800 pages thick. Now I made a printout of the ebook, and it looks like this. So it's a gigantic book, and it's very ambitious. So I wanted to review it, but I have to do it as a video review because I try to write a normal review, but of course because the book was published in 2004, it can no longer be reviewed in the typical journals because they only review new books or relatively new books. So the full title is Vom traditionellen China zu modernen Taiwan, die Entwicklung funktionaler Differenzierung am Beispiel des politischen Systems und des Religionssystems. So I would translate this as From Traditional China to Modern Taiwan, subtitle, The Development of Functional Differentiation Illustrated by Reference to the Political and Religious Systems. Now, Professor Tang works very much in the so-called Luhmann school of social differentiation. His PhD supervisor was Professor Chih-Chieh, who is a prominent figure in the Luhmann school of social differentiation. Now, I will here provide a very, very brief summary of this work, and then I would link it to the comparative perspective of China and democracy, Western democracies and democracies in East Asia. And then finally, I will try to look what the possible implications of this work could be for understanding contemporary China, that is the People's Republic of China. Now that is not actually part of this work, because this work only deals with social differentiation in Imperial China and then goes to modern Taiwan. But I still think it's possible to draw some important insights from this work concerning modern Taiwan and modern China and the differences between them. So, but before I start, I should say something about social differentiation perspective. So what does it mean to look at social differentiation in society? What does it mean to study society from a social differentiation perspective? Now, in every society, you have different human types. You have different fields, different systems, so to speak. But this is not a static thing. There are differences between societies in terms of how they are differentiated and the degree to which they are differentiated. So if we take, let's say, an extreme example, ancient Egypt, the pharaoh is both a king and the high priest and the richest person in the country. But in a contemporary Western society, you would have the differentiation of the government, so the political elite, the state bureaucracy, the business and economy, university, academia, science, journalism as a separate field, let's say religion. Just to give some examples of important social fields in society. Now, this theoretical paradigm started to emerge in the 18th century with the classical political economists. So think about figures such as Adam Smith, who theorized about the division of labor. So with the rise of modern societies, you could see that labor became more and more divided. So you have a factory and one person would just be in charge of one part of the machine, and another person would have another very specific function. Whereas before, let's say a farmer or an artisan did everything, did more things at once. Now, then with the rise of the classical sociologists, this paradigm expands. So Durkheim, the French sociologist, looks at the differentiation of social roles, and Weber looks at the differentiation of Wertsphären, value spheres in society. Now then you have more contemporary theorists such as Bourdieu, Luhmann, and the Israeli sociologist Eisenstadt. And here you truly see the social differentiation paradigm reaching maturity. So Bourdieu, he theorizes the differentiation of different fields of struggle, different social prestige games in society, and each field can be more or less autonomous. Luhmann looks at the functional differentiation of these systems, of these fields, and Eisenstadt looks at the differentiation of what he calls centers or elites, so the differentiation between different types of elites: political, religious, bureaucratic, etc. So, in fact, the social differentiation paradigm is one of the three main paradigms of sociology, as I see it. One of the three main components or dimensions of society. So it stands alongside of stratification. So stratification would be, if you look at societies and you focus on stratification, you look at who's rich, who's poor, who's influential, who's uninfluential, how are the resources in society divided, who are the winners, who are the losers, to express it in a bit of a Donald Trump way. Now, if you look at social differentiation, you're actually looking at something that's in a sense more abstract, because you're not just talking about winners and losers, who gets a certain type of resource. You look at the differentiation of lifestyles, of value system, of hierarchies, of different professional spheres. The journalist with his or her own field, professional field, and way of doing things, and standards of professionalism. Religious authorities as separate from political authorities. Philosophy, which differentiated out of religion, out of theology, and then natural science differentiating out of philosophy. So that's a very different angle on societies, the social differentiation perspective. So you would first have what is most visible to most people would be the stratification perspective. Who gets the resources? It's vertical. Then you have the horizontal differentiation, social differentiation perspective. And then thirdly, you would have such a thing as something like networks. So everyone is also part of a social network. This would be the school of thought associated with someone like Manuel Castells. So these three things exist in societies. You have hierarchies, division of resources. You have the differentiation of different social fields, and you have networks who are moving through these fields and these hierarchies. Now, Professor Tang provides what is probably the first truly systematic account of the history of social differentiation of imperial China, leading all the way from ancient China to the formation of modern Taiwan. Now, in the feudal stage, so we're talking about a period of Chinese history that is more than 2,000 years, that existed more than 2,000 years ago. You had a vertical differentiation between people, so not a functionally differentiated differentiation. So you would have ordinary people versus aristocrats. You would have city people versus people from the countryside. These were important distinctions in social life. But only with the Qing and the foundation of the bureaucratic imperial empire in the 3rd century before the Common Era do you truly get functional differentiation, field differentiation. However, functional differentiation in imperial China throughout the history of imperial China was relatively modest compared to functional differentiation in let's take early modern Europe or the modern West. Because you saw the functional differentiation of the political system, yes, but that political system was so dominant that it actually subdued the functional differentiation of other social spheres in society, other social systems. Under the political field of Imperial China, with the emperor at the top, the Confucian scholar, official bureaucrats below him, formed this very powerful hierarchy. And this hierarchy and the value system that belonged to it was so dominant that it kept other spheres from truly differentiating, from establishing themselves as autonomous fields. Now this political field under the emperor and this Confucian scholar officials divided society up in a hierarchical fashion. So they put the scholar or scholar politician or scholar official at the top. Below him were the farmers. Below them were the artisans. Below them, at the lowest level, were the merchants. Now this cultural system, this social structure, this regime, more or less existed for 2,000 years, with relatively minor variations. It became especially reified and formalized during the early Tang dynasty in the 7th century, with the introduction of the imperial exam system. So the Confucian scholars and students would take an exam on the Confucian classics, and you had different levels of exams, and depending on whether you passed the exam and your score and the level of exam you passed, you would be assigned a powerful position in the bureaucracy. So all the important people in China, in Imperial China, especially since the introduction of this formalized exam system, were Confucian scholars, and they had the Confucian degree. Now, there's a striking passage in the work of Professor Tang. Oh, by the way, I haven't actually mentioned the title of the work because it's in German. So it's from traditionellen China to modernen Taiwan. Oh, I did actually mention it. Sorry. Good. So, in page 92, there's a striking passage. Because there he said, more or less, and I'm paraphrasing very loosely here. Okay, after this bureaucratic empire was established, for 2,000 years, not much happened concerning the fundamental structure of Chinese society. But he doesn't say it quite that strongly, but he goes in that direction. And that's a striking thing to say for a scholar, because we scholars, we're always in this game where we try to say that everything is extremely nuanced, and a typical thing for a scholar to say would be to say, okay, it's less monolithic than is commonly thought. There are more important variations. There's more nuance. That's a thing scholars in different settings, in different fields, no matter what topic they discuss, this is something they will often say. So when a scholar then actually says, such as Professor Tang, well, there were perhaps some important variations, but it's relatively minor compared to the continuities. That's a striking thing to say. So what were the important variations? So in those 2,000 years of imperial history, you had, of course, the Mongol dynasty, the Yuan dynasty, which disrupted the system to some extent, especially in the beginning of the Yuan dynasty. And then during the Ming and the Qing, so that's the last 600 years of imperial history, you see that the system, the Chinese society becomes particularly closed off, and that the political field becomes even more powerful. And this power structure where the one central field, this one political field dominates the whole society, intensifies. Now, this is only the first part of the book, and there's so much complexity in here that this short overview cannot do justice to it. But this is in fact only the first part of the book, because the second part of the book looks at the social differentiation of Taiwan, of modern Taiwan in particular. So if this would have been the whole book, this first part on the history of Imperial China, it would have been an ambitious project already, because it's the first systematic account of social differentiation in Imperial Chinese history. But actually there's this whole second part of the book which looks at Taiwan. Now, and I looked at how Taiwan emerged from Chinese civilization and then democratized in the 20th century. So for most of Taiwanese history, Taiwan was actually on the periphery of Chinese civilization. It was only during the Ming that it became truly integrated into the Chinese system, into the Chinese regime, so to speak. It's only during the Ming that the Chinese scholar official type truly becomes to dominate cultural and social life in Taiwan. Before that, the more traditional aristocracy was still rather influential. Now, social differentiation then takes a big leap in the era of Japanese colonialism, which brought in Western modernization. And then there's a second leap when in the second half of the 20th century, Taiwan begins to democratize. Now, the democratization of Taiwan has everything to do with social differentiation. Because the democratization was about political democratization, about economic liberalization, about legal reform, about educational reform, and about the free press. Now, all these developments involve differentiation processes. So we shouldn't imagine this as Taiwanese activists, democracy activists, running around proclaiming the importance of a socially differentiated society. And then no one says that. It's too abstract, it's too scholarly. That's not how people look at their society. Right? These are very abstract processes. So people don't shout, we want a more socially differentiated society. Of course they shout, we want a democratic society with a free press and more economic freedom. But these things actually involve social differentiation because they involve more autonomy for the economic field, for the business field. They involve more autonomy for the legal field. They involve more autonomy for education. That's more free from the political field and from political propaganda, political ideology, and more freedom for journalism. Now this was a very, very brief summary of a very thick work that has been almost completely overlooked in international academia and should get much more attention. Though this is difficult because the work is written in German and it's expensive and it's very thick. So I understand why this work has been overlooked, but it's a shame because it possesses such a rich analysis. Now, one of the implications of this work is that it confirms something that many have already speculated about, namely that Imperial China, for most of its history, was much less socially differentiated than European societies. And this is something that has been strongly theorized by the Israeli sociologist Eisenstadt, who compared different civilizations from a social differentiation perspective. And he had already been arguing, in fact, that Confucian China had a much lower level of social differentiation and that Europe had a much higher level of social differentiation. But he was painting with a very broad brush. Right? Now we actually have a systematic study that seems to confirm this perspective. If you look at, let's say, early modern Europe, let's take the 17th century Dutch Republic. So I'm from the Netherlands, I'm from Amsterdam, so it's one of my favorite examples. You saw a high level of what Eisenstadt calls status incongruity. That means that status incongruity means that you could have one form of status or power or prestige. You could be high up in one social hierarchy without being automatically high up in other social hierarchies, without possessing other forms of prestige. So in a society which has a high level of social differentiation, you tend to have a high level of status incongruity. So let's take the famous painter Rembrandt. Rembrandt was a famous painter, very prestigious during his lifetime, but only artistically prestigious. He was not a powerful politician. He was probably not even that rich. He was not a leading scholar. Now, if you look at the 17th century Dutch Republic, you see that these elites are fairly differentiated from each other. You see a relatively high level of social differentiation. And modern society is, of course, marked by the highest level of social differentiation. But then, when you look at Imperial China and the Confucian scholar official, the reason Imperial China was so lowly differentiated is because the Confucian scholar official was everything at once. So the Confucian scholar official was a politician, a bureaucrat, a scholar, a philosopher, an artist, a poet, a judge, sometimes even a military commander, and they were also the richest people in the country, heteronymizing or diminishing the autonomy of, let's say, pure business. So we see China for most of its history really had a rather different social structure because of the dominance of the Confucian scholar official type. Now, this legacy, to some extent, actually carries over into the present. And now we are extending the argument beyond what Professor Tang analyzed, because Professor Tang looked at Imperial China and Taiwan. But if you look at the contemporary China, so the mainland, the People's Republic of China, communist China, so to speak, you'll see this low field differentiation legacy, because the Communist Party concentrates so much power and prestige in one organization, the Communist Party state. Now, an interesting study which traces this low field differentiation in Chinese education is the book Governing Educational Desire by Andrew Kipnis. He's an anthropologist and he studied Chinese schools. And one of the most fascinating ideas in his new work, was published in 2011, is the idea of the holistic hierarchy. That, to a large extent, still, the Chinese education is ruled by what he calls the imperial governing complex, so the legacy of Imperial China. And one of the ways it expresses itself in contemporary Chinese education is the idea of the holistic hierarchy. So this is the idea that students and other people can be ranked in a kind of holistic hierarchy that determines the absolute or total quality of the human being. So the idea would be that students who are ahead academically are also ahead morally, are also ahead athletically, and are sort of the total picture. Now, of course, sometimes a student can be good at one subject and not good at another subject. And Professor Kipnis argues that in China there's much less appreciation of this diversity, and there's much more hostility towards it. Because the ideal is very much that the student should be excellent in all domains of life and should be a high quality person in general. This is this is the focus in education, but of course it reflects the power structure of Chinese society as a whole, contemporary China, People's Republic China. Because the leaders of the country are also supposed to be sort of total leaders. They are moral exemplars. They are not just powerful, but they're moral exemplars in a much broader sense. Now, when I look at these contemporary studies and think about the low field differentiation legacy of Imperial China in the modern world, what I'm particularly interested in is the connection of this legacy to the difference of democracy versus authoritarianism. That is, it seems that field differentiation, social differentiation is intimately connected to democratization, or at least that democracy needs a high level of field differentiation. This gives a little bit of a new spin to the social differentiation perspective, because a theorist such as Bourdieu, he would stress the tension between democracy and field autonomy. He would say, okay, once you have this autonomous field developing its or establishing a degree of autonomy, there's always the risk. Perhaps it's good in itself, this process, but there's always the risk that it becomes an undemocratic, that this autonomous elite of the field becomes an undemocratic closed structure that's hostile towards democratic control. And Luhmann, in his famous arguments with Habermas, also sees a lot of tension between at least the narrative of democracy and social differentiation. Because social differentiation splits society up into all these subfields, subsystems. So that where is democracy? Where is the demos? Where are the people? Right? The people is split up. So though this is all very insightful, we should not therefore overlook that field differentiation was also very important for the formation of democracy. First of all, historically, you see that in the 16th and 17th century, when the European societies become more intensively differentiated, when this is a period when social differentiation takes a big leap, you'll see the formation of proto-democratic societies, or at least that's what I would argue. And I would argue that you can see how, I think you can easily see how social differentiation and democracy are connected. Because what is civil society if not a society empowered by social differentiation? Because in order to have a democracy, you need an empowered society vis-a-vis politics. And social differentiation creates alternative platforms of power in society. And then, of course, the democratic public sphere. In order to have a democratic public sphere, you need to have discussion about something, right? So in a socially differentiated society, you need a public sphere because all these different field elites need to communicate with each other somehow. If you have, in Imperial China, if you have this one hierarchy which dominates everything, there's not much room for a democratic public sphere, for critical discussions about society. Because if there's any fundamental disagreements, the scholar officials will discuss it among themselves. And there are not many fundamental value conflicts being discussed prominently in the public sphere, because there's one dominant value system, that of the Confucian scholar officials. So only in a more socially differentiated society, where you have all these different value systems clashing into each other, can the public sphere truly flourish. Or actually, you need a public sphere to a larger extent. Now, this is mostly my argument. I'm not sure to what extent Professor Tang would agree with this assessment. And we are certainly getting ahead of ourselves here. Because Professor Tang's work already started a very ambitious project, namely to map out the history of social differentiation in Imperial China and to make a connection, to show how Taiwan features in this story and how Taiwan emerged from Chinese civilization and then underwent a more thorough differentiation process under the influence of Western modernization as it was democratizing in the late 20th century. So that is already, those are actually two already very ambitious projects right there. And so what I then would like to add, or at least what I would like to, I would like to stress that this enormously ambitious project by Professor Tang opens up the question of how different social differentiation emerged in China compared to social differentiation in the West. So the big challenge, the big intellectual challenge would be to study social differentiation in China comparatively. So Professor Tang has a historically comparative perspective, but now we need a regime comparative perspective. Imperial China versus Western democracy, and democracies in East Asia versus Communist Party China. So I will end on this note, and I've certainly not done justice to this work in this very brief overview, But I hope to stress that it's an overlooked work, and that the question of social differentiation in Chinese history and as it concerns contemporary Chinese society deserves much more attention, because it is the key to understanding the difference between Chinese civilization and the West, and the key to understanding democratization processes in East Asia.